is Nikki. Okay, my name is Nikki Chrisman Green, and I am one of the members of the state bar. The African. Let me breathe. God, it's been a rough day, y'all. I lost my dog today, so I'm just really trying to get myself together. So I apologize. I really do, and we're going to keep this going, and we're going to keep this going in a good way. So I am so grateful to all of our panelists and to all of you guys that are attending today to hear this very informative session on HB 3979 and SB 3. They are two legislative bills that were passed in the Texas sessions this earlier on last year that impact curriculum that is being taught in the schools. We are the name of the bill does not mention critical race theory, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but it's been coined as the critical race theory legislation. And so I just want to be, transparent and put that out there. What I wanted to do during this session is we're going to hear from our panelists that have a wealth of knowledge. We are still waiting for one to log on. She's having some computer problems. So she will be joining us shortly. And so in the meantime, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and allow everyone to that's on the panel to introduce themselves, starting with Justin Chapa.
Thank you, Nikki. My name is Justin Chapa. I'm really glad to be here.
Oh, you went on mute.
Sorry, I lost my signal there. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm of counsel at Morgan Lewis and the Dallas office and the appellate and government enforcement groups. Previously was a teacher through Teach for America. I taught 12th grade government and economics in Brownsville, Texas, and was born and raised in Arlington, right between Dallas and Fort Worth. And after law school, moved back home, had the opportunity to clerk for federal Judge David Godbee and Fifth Circuit Judge Katharina Haynes. But at the same time, started volunteering with my hometown school district, Arlington ISD, and one thing that led to another. And after several years of serving on citizen oversight committees, was appointed to the board in 2017 and elected to the board in 2018 and 19 and running again right now. I'm also on the board of directors for the Texas Association of School Boards, which is the statewide advocacy organization for every school district in Texas. And I'm one of the directors from the Region 11 seats and represent about 77 additional school districts through that.
Okay, and Grace, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, ma'am. Glad to be here. My name is Grace Alleman, and I am a product of Fort Worth Schools, and I have retired in 2012 from education. After 37 years, I served as a principal, assistant principal, director, personnel director during the course of those 37 years. So I have a lot of experience. I serve as personnel for instructional services as well as non-instructional services. So I have, and I also have a master's degree in counseling. So I am glad to be a part of this, and I'm very passionate about education. I do work frequently now. I substitute for principals and assistant principals, and I declare that it's no longer a job, it's a ministry. And so I'm glad to participate in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. And Rudy is our former, the immediate past chair, and also a councilman in Pflugerville. And so he is joining us today, and I'll let him do a brief introduction and we'll get started.
Yeah, me.
It'll be a very brief introduction. Rudy Metayer. I am honored to help, our president-elect, or chair-elect, Nikki Chrisman Green over here with this moderation right there. I want to make sure we thank our current chair, Paul Stafford, regarding the creation of the CLE. One of the most important things that we've said constantly over and over again regarding this section is that we want to make sure that we have topics that aren't just relevant to our legal community, but our community in general. I think that at this moment in time, when we're looking at true systemic issues throughout society, it's important for us to bring relevant, honest material regarding these topics, because a lot of times you're going to hear a lot of conjecture, you're going to hear a lot of viewpoints and ideas, but you're not hearing about the real facts and concerns and issues that are really pragmatic over here. I think, as Ms. Grace just said, I really do think it is a ministry what's going on in our school districts right now. As you've seen, there's a lot of miscommunication, concern, frankly, fear. And so I think people like Grace, I think people like Justin, who are on the front lines trying to go ahead and help address these issues and try to make a discernible difference, because right now more than ever, we need to make sure that we understand that our schools are being used as a battleground that they shouldn't be used for, that they shouldn't be talked about. We're talking about education of our children. That's what we want to do. And that's why people go into this field, not to go ahead and throw some political footballs at each other regarding things right there as well. So look forward to this conversation, and thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you, Rudy. As always, we appreciate you. I am going to go ahead. So what I wanted to do is I want to level set before we get to the panelists, because they have great information. We just did this seminar a couple of days ago, and it was very informative, kind of ran over time. But I want to give a little bit of background of the legislation that was passed and critical race theory as a whole, so that before we ask them questions, we have kind of a foundation of how we got here. Right. And so I'm going to show a PowerPoint slide, and you guys let me know if you can see it. I think that's the right one. Can you guys see that PowerPoint? Let me know if it's too big. Can everybody see that PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, okay, one of our panelists is, she's gonna, I'm gonna be, one second. Paul, if you could look for a Jessica Patterson, she's just gonna log into the regular Zoom, and then if you could promote her as a panelist, I would greatly appreciate that.
Okay.
And she said she is on, Jessica Patterson. Okay, so what is critical race theory, right? That's a very good question, and you'll see question marks here because there's not really a true definition of what critical race theory is. It's a concept, and it is and we'll talk about more about what that concept is, but there's not truly a definition that has been used consistently in the laws that are being passed and the conversations that the legislatures are having. As a matter of fact, when I was researching for this presentation, I saw that 9 states have since in the last year have passed legislation on this type of bill with respect to restraining or restricting what's taught in the school curriculums, or what they're coining as critical race theory bills. Those 9 states are Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, hi Jessica, South Carolina, and Arizona and North Dakota. And what's funny is that of those bills, that of the states that have passed those bills, none of the states have used the term critical race theory, nor have they referred to critical race theory within the legislation. So that's interesting of itself. And also one of the reasons why there's so much confusion, because if the bill doesn't define what is considered critical race theory or what curriculum should or should not be taught, it makes the bill very broad and difficult to ascertain as to what would be prohibited. So I thought in order to kind of be fair, I would just use the definition that's in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And if you look at this definition, it is very, it's a lot going on here, but basically it just says that it's an intellectual and social movement that is loosely organized framework that's based on the premise that race is not a natural biological ground feature of physical distinct subgroups of human beings, blah, blah, blah. So what is that really saying? It's a concept. Right. And that concept basically says that racism is inherent. So it's not that it is based on a certain person or a certain place or a certain thing, basically. It is that it's a concept that U.S. social institutions such as the criminal justice system, the education system, the labor market, the housing market, and the healthcare system are laced with racism that's embedded in our laws, regulations, rules, and procedures that will lead to different outcomes based on your race, right? So it's not necessarily saying that a certain race is inferior or a certain race is superior, or even that a certain race is racist. It's just saying that there are inherent principles or concepts within different structures that are inherently racist. So if you look at the history of critical race theory, you will see that the first annual workshop was actually back in 1989. However, the theory can actually be traced back to the 70s, even as early as the 60s. Derek Bell who was the first tenured African-American law professor at Harvard Law School, is credited as being one of the originators of critical race theory. And basically what Mr. Bell had, or Professor Bell, what he had indicated was that he saw that as more civil rights lawsuits or cases were being found, that it was as if racism was growing even more. It was even more inherent in some of the constructs or in some of the issues that were going on. And so from that, he began a study and wrote a couple of books, and it became kind of a discussion, right, in academia about critical race theory. Then later on, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who is a law professor at Columbia Law School and UCLA, would coin the term critical race theory. She is credited with kind of designing or giving the name to this theory that was discussed back in the 70s by Derek Bell. So I say all that to say this. What does this have to do with our middle schoolers? I think Rudy brought up a good point in his introduction, is that we have seen this legislation be litigated. We've seen a lot of, not litigated, but a lot of legislation passed. We've seen a lot of discussions across political spectrums in regards to the critical race theory, right? It's not being taught in schools, or not having certain books and different things going on. And so when we look at that, we stop and we ask, well, are we even teaching these concepts in kindergarten through 12th grade, right? So it's not clear to what degree educators in kindergarten to 12th grade are even teaching these concepts or even using the curriculum materials. If you do research on the data based on the curriculum that is currently taught in the schools, you'll find that in most cases, critical race theories and curriculums dealing with this concept are academic courses or discussions that are in college level classes or beyond. You're not gonna, you don't really see this curriculum being taught in school. As a matter of fact, many scholars have indicated, because of the way that critical race theory is explained and the concepts that are used, most academic or educators that are in kindergarten through 12th grade are not even able to get the materials that they would need to teach this in the class, nor is there a certain approved curriculum, a certain book, or anything that really pushes this theory. And so then the question becomes, why do we need legislation to control the critical race theory that's being taught in the classes? What exactly is the problem? And do we see that there's an issue where this could become a problem, where race is discussed in a way that maybe is not supported from a scholarly standpoint? And so that's where we get to the bills that were passed. Because with HB 3979, one of the reasons that they said that they passed the bill was to ensure that students were being taught fairly and equitable, right? And HB 3979 was the first bill that was passed in June. It was signed into law in June, but it was passed during the first legislative session. And this bill, guys, went through a lot of back and forth, right? Initially, it failed. And then what happened is there were some amendments that were added to add certain foundational teaching documents, and it was sent back to the Senate. They sent it in the Texas legislature. And then they added all of these founding documents that needed to be taught. It was a long list of things that would need to be taught in the curriculum. And then in that long list, some of our Democratic leaders in the House and in the Senate added additional ones, because there were quite a few that were left off that dealt with race, that dealt with diversity, that dealt with historical documents that are typically taught that go back towards slavery and just some of the civil rights movements. And so there were some amendments that were made. Well, when it was passed and it went back, after it failed, they went back and they redid it. And a lot of those documents, they took out a lot of the stuff that was supposed to have been added. So in summary, what happened was, with that legislation, it directed the Texas Board of Education to what they call adopt essential knowledge of skills that would develop the student's civic knowledge. And so those are the founding documents that were added. Some of those documents that were added dealt with, and I have my little list here because it was quite a few of them, but they dealt with the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence. There were some on hold on. There were documents that were dealing with the Constitution, the Federalist Papers. the Lincoln Douglas debate, and then they went back and they amended it and added some additional documents. Sally Hemings, the Chicano movement, the Snyder Act of 1924, and also they added the history of white supremacy. And with that history of white supremacy, there was a section in the bill that says that that teachers are only allowed to teach of the moral wrong of the white supremacy with respect to the KKK. It also added additional legislation that said that teachers cannot be forced to discuss current events or widely debated controversial issues. If you'll remember with the George Floyd incident and just all of the different police involved criminal justice movements, this became a hot topic at the time. And so there were some conversations, not necessarily in school, but just in general, just regular everyday conversation. And so in order to prevent that, they basically said that any topics that teachers explore that are happening from current events must have a varying perspective. So you can teach it, but you have to have a varying perspective without giving deference or saying that one was better than the other. It also prevents teachers from introducing lessons that could cause a student to feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other kind of form of psychological distress on the account of the individual's race or sex. It also prevents schools and educators from offering extra credit course for any activism or lobbying activities. And this one is interesting because there was a project that third graders and fourth graders would do where they would write to the Texas House and the Texas legislature, and they would pick a topic and they would write letters. It was teaching them how to do advocacy and teaching them how to write to their senators. They can't do that anymore under this legislation. That was one of the things that they would not be allowed to do. It also prohibits schools from requiring educators to take any training, orientation, or therapy that presents any kind of form of race or sex stereotyping or blames on the basis of race or sex. Very broad, not really clear what that means, but one could liken that to maybe diversity and inclusion classes or things that would teach you on one class or in one arena that one race is being more sensitive to one race by doing this or not doing that. And so that's what HB 3979 did. The full text, and I will send out this presentation, the full text of that bill is here, but I'm not going to go through that in the interest of time. Now, HB 379 was passed during the regular legislative session. SB 3 was passed during the second legislative session that took place this past year. And what it did was it replaced HB 3979. Now, with respect to SB 3 kind of circled back to what was initially kind of considered in those bills to restrict the curriculum that was taught. And as a result, SB 3 is actually, even though it's broader than HB 3979, it's actually more restrictive, right? Some of the things that SB 3 did was they removed the list of required readings. So remember how I was going through the documents and I was saying that HB 3979 actually found the documents that you had to cover within a civics course. Well, SB 3 removed that list. It also prohibits instruction and discussions about certain concepts related to race, sex, and diversity and discrimination, not only in social studies classes, but in history, government, and civic courses. So it kind of expanded across the curriculums on what could be taught, whereas HB 3979 was directed more towards like a social studies class. It also prohibits school districts, charter schools, which is something to think about, or state agencies from seeking any kind of private funding to develop curriculum, training materials for courses in the social studies curriculum. So you can't go outside and get those additional like subjects or journals or curriculum that you would get to bring into your class or to get funding to do that. It also provides that private citizens cannot sue teachers for what they consider a violation, but it does allow educators to be fired if they are found to have violated district policies. And it did what HB 3979 did not do, and it gave the power to the Texas Education Agency to create these enforcement policies and rules to enforce how social studies will be taught. And so SB 3 kind of rounded out what HB 3979 left out. It's broader. And so the problem there is it leaves even more room for interpretation of what can and cannot be done. And we'll kind of talk about that when we get into our panel. I have the full text of SB 3 here. When you get the presentation, if you get a chance, I always recommend that you read the law. I hate for people to read snippets in news news bites and releases and not really understand what the actual law covers. So when you get a chance, if you want to have the full knowledge of what is and what isn't permitted, I would start with SB3 because HB 3979 has been replaced by SB3. And also, before we get to our panelists, I just want to say that the Texas Education Agency created a wonderful chart that compares both bills. And what it did was it looked at what HB 3979 had put in place and then what SB3 does and compares the two as to how they related. So this chart is a very thorough chart. It kind of goes through the entire bill to let you know what can and cannot be done.
Nikki, can I add something further quickly? Yeah, I just want to give a real world example of what Nikki just articulated when it came to private funding for state agencies and school districts. One of the things that the State Bar of Texas, I'm also an attorney at Graves Doherty and also executive director for the Texas Black Caucus Foundation. And you know that I'm proud of our caucus members working very hard to speak about these specific issues. Some of the interesting nuances of not even be able to teach about Martin Luther King Jr. and his teachings at our schools, which cause apprehension. No, Grace, I know you're exactly right. And, you know, them fighting hard on that specific issue. But I also want to point out that for this specific instance, the State Bar of Texas for years has had one of the most robust law-related education programs in the entire country, something that was well-respected, well-known what it does to educate and help, frankly, supplement a lot of school districts, a lot of schools who can't afford a curriculum or the ability or the information to build a supply to them for their students in a variety of different ways. They did this in particular when it came to the Constitution and various different legal issues and rights from there. Where did the State Bar usually get that money from? Private donations from major firms across the state that would actually go ahead and folks would actually donate their own money and time because they think, hey, listen, you know, kids need to be more educated about the Constitution, about different things, you know, history. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's go help create the next course of attorneys in this state, particularly when we're coming from some of the most underserved low-income communities in the state. If we want to actually have an inclusive bar, we need to start from there, from education from the get-go to make those become future lawyers. Now with this curriculum comes into play, whether or not because of this, because what you have with this statutory action right here comes into play is that the inability or the confusion as to whether or not that's appropriate. So there's a lot of things that often happens at the state legislature, which our panel will go ahead and address thoroughly on that. They think, hey, listen, in theory, these are great ideas. These are great things right there as well. But practicality, they hurt and destroy people in so many different ways and ramifications that are just trying to happen that it frustrates and frankly, a lot of times angers people who are just trying to do good by our kids.
Thank you for that, Rudy. That's very good information. That's why I like having you on my panel. You're so smart. I want to get to some questions now with my panelists. And before we do that, Jessica, if you want to introduce yourself real quick, you did not get the opportunity to do that. If you could just tell us your name and your background and what you currently do and how it's related to the educational system, I would greatly appreciate that. All
right, Nikki, I'm sorry for all the mix-up.
You're fine. It's been one of those days. You're fine.
Like me, by the way. So like Nikki said, my name is Jessica Patterson. I am the owner of the JRP Law Firm right here in Houston, Texas, where I do school law, estate planning, and small business. I would say the majority of my practice is school law. Prior to this, I worked for a company called Roger Morrison Grover, which was an outside litigation firm that represents school districts. I was in the education system myself as a teacher and as a diagnostician for 9 years. So I'm very excited to be here and I won't be long-winded.
As you can see, my panelists I wanted to make sure that I got someone that was currently in the educational system litigating and a board member with the school district. And so as you can see, they have a wealth of knowledge. And so again, I appreciate them taking out the time, being willing to speak on this, because like I said, this is a hot topic. One of the things that I want to ask, and I'm going to start out with Ms. Harris and Ms. Patterson, since they were teachers within the school district, or, you know, they have the educator background. As I stated at the beginning of this presentation, and something that I've heard a lot, is that we don't even know why this critical race theory or why this banning of these subjects is necessary, because these are not things that are already being taught. Shouldn't be a concern for this being taught in kindergarten through 12th grade, because it's not something that is currently on the curriculum. Do you agree with that? And Grace, I will start with you. And if we could limit our answers to about maybe 2 minutes apiece, that will help us to keep moving with the rest of the questions that we have.
I think I can you hear me? I think I
Yes,
can
we can hear.
less than 2 minutes. Since our last meeting, I've talked to some other principals and other districts, and they go along with our discussion the other night. Everything is so vague. None of it makes sense. It's very difficult to put into practice something that you clearly don't understand or that's not presented in a way that it can be put into practice. And so it just, in their opinion, it creates more chaos and confusion, and it's just a distraction. And they see it as an extension of the current political climate. And they also feel like it is synonymous with systemic racism, and that it's not a concept or a noun or anything that can be clearly defined. Obviously, it hasn't been defined, but it is obvious in our practices, not only in education, but in economics, in other areas of life where you see systemic racism. And it's by design, and unfortunately impacts people of color very much so. That's it. That's how they see it.
Thank you. Jessica, is this a curriculum that you saw when you were an educator, or is this something that you have seen through your experience of being an educator? These type of lessons that would create concerns for a need to have a critical race theory type bill.
I no, and I will say I did teach math, but no, I didn't see anything where anyone was teaching anything that was super controversial, like they're trying to make this law seem why it's needed. I think one of the biggest problems is they haven't defined what critical race theory is and what a critical race lesson looks like. So it's almost impossible to say whether or not, if it at all is being taught in the classroom. I know I wasn't teaching, when I look at critical race from, what I learned in law school, about the infrastructure and systematic racism, it's so complex that I wasn't teaching it in my classroom, and I don't know any teacher that was.
Justin, let me ask you this, because I would love to get your opinion on this. What do you think, based on those answers, and just from your experience with the school boards, what impact do you think that this bill will have on the curriculum or the school boards or in the schools in general? I mean, especially if this is not something that we're seeing, what do you think the impact will be?
I think in the short run, there will be impacts just because it's new, it's a hot button issue, and people from different perspectives are going to use this as a reason to reach out to teachers, to school boards, administrators for a variety of reasons, and on both or really multiple sides of the issues that this bill touches upon. But I think your point, Nikki, that you made earlier is that you like people to read the full bill because there's a lot of misinformation out there, I think, really on both sides of this issue. And I think in the long run, I don't expect this bill to have that big of an impact on education, and especially if administrators and school boards do their part in making sure that any grievances filed over this are, addressed properly and not made into sort of political sideshows where a teacher an educator who's done nothing really wrong isn't supported. I think if educators who are teaching real history are supported and real social issues are supported, then I don't think it's going to make a difference. And I think you can look at, and I said this in the last time I spoke on this, there's really two parts to this bill. And really, if you look at them closely, there's sort of much ado about nothing in both parts. And I would say one part is the part that sets out what should be taught in terms of the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, or the TEKS. And a lot of them duplicate TEKS that probably are already taught in different social science curriculum across the state. For example, the civil rights amendments to the Constitution are already touched on in almost any high school history class. And there's no way you can talk about issues of or avoid talking about issues of race with respect to talking about, for example, the 14th Amendment, which has had a different interpretation over time and is one of the primary tools today to enforce civil rights. There's also another part of the SB 3 that is the part that I think gets a little bit of attention because it says that teachers can't do certain things or schools can't require certain things. Well, if you look closely at some parts of that, and I'm not saying all, but some parts of that, they are essentially restatements of anti-discrimination law to some extent. It would be, I think, problematic for school districts or teachers to require students to believe that certain races are inferior or superior, or that certain races, because certain individuals, because of their race, simply, they have certain attributes by virtue of that. And I think that teaching would be problematic regardless of SB3. And so I think when you look down the road, especially with no enforcement mechanism and private right of action, I think that the bill ultimately will have been another hot button, red meat issue that led to legislation that is so vague that it really doesn't do much.
Thank you for that, Justin. One more question. I'm going to circle back to you again, Justin, and then I'm going to go to Jessica on this one. SB3 does state that teachers shall explore the topic objectively and in a manner free from political bias. Who determines whether something has been stated in an objective manner? Justin, how do we interpret that section, or how should teachers, or how do you think administrative boards, school boards are going to interpret that for the purposes of enforcing?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think it's so vague that it's hard to enforce it and really just restate standards that already exist. Here in Arlington ISD, and this predates my time on the board, and I don't have any special insight into this particular incident, but several years before I got on the board, there was a high-profile incident at one of our elementary schools there was among a grade level an effort to do a performative lesson about the Civil War, and there were some aspects of that lesson involving slavery that some people found really offensive, and not necessarily portrayed in an objective manner. And the grievance was filed over that, and it ended up being a pretty hot button issue for that campus community, that ultimately led to the principal resigning and a whole bunch of other issues. But all of which is to say that happened long before these bills were in anyone's mind. And so I think if you're asking someone to be objective, but you're not providing a standard to guide that conduct, you're just asking for people to make judgment calls, which they already do. And Nikki, I don't have the bill right in front of me, but I believe that provision also goes on to say, essentially, the teacher should try to present, different perspectives and be objective, basically to the best extent that they can. They need to it doesn't use the word good faith, but, they need to try. And so I think that even waters it down further. So what is it, if a teacher tries, yeah. So if a teacher's trying to be, open-minded about something, or try to incorporate when they do talk about hot button issues, to the extent they come up, if they're making an effort to not be one-sided in that, I think that's all you can ask for. And in my opinion, there's certainly going to be some issues that don't lend themselves to multiple perspectives. I think it'd be hard, the example we had up here where an administrator was essentially suggesting a teacher should objectively present multiple perspectives on the Holocaust. I mean, I think that's one of those things that gets on the news because it's just such an extreme example. But I think those things are few and far between. And I think most educators are already, knowledgeable enough to know when they're touching on an issue that people have reasonable different perspectives on, and already trying to address it.
Thank you, Jessica. In your experience or with litigating these cases, how different do you think when they get an administrative process, or what do you envision that will look like for teachers with respect to responding to complaints that they get?
I think it's definitely going to be difficult because, again, who defines what's objective? What I think may be objective, I could feel like I'm being impartial, but another student could take it a different way and go home and tell their parent, because it's really the parents that are bringing this fight, this charge against the teachers for what they're teaching. And so I think it definitely puts teachers in a tough spot where I can see a lot of educators saying, I don't want to touch none of it. Because with everything else going on, it just makes it extremely difficult that anything you say can be scrutinized. Because again, how do you find objective? Of course, in a legal sense, we think reasonable person, but what's reasonable when you're talking about the Holocaust? And of course, I agree with Justin, it's such an extreme example, but that's what happens when you have administrators trying to interpret these very vague laws that are not well defined. And that's honestly, if you read the text of the law, that's what it says. It does say topics like the Holocaust and topics like the criminal justice system and slavery, try to have opposing views and speak from both sides. And even if it's not their intention of saying that, you know, as an educator, I would have to try to speak from both sides.
No, and that's a good point, because I think one of the things that we talked about when we were preparing and we were kind of having our discussions, if you look at the situation that happened in Colleyville with James Whitfield, for those that are not familiar with the story, he was the first Black principal of Colleyville Heritage High School. And he was also one of the first educators to be accused of teaching and promoting critical race theory. He said that it wasn't true. We don't have the full facts, so we're not going to get into an analysis of that, to be fair, on both sides. However, the question now becomes because we already seen some of this happening in the South Lake Independent School District, which is right in my backyard, with claims that are being made that a student felt uncomfortable, that there was a book in the classroom and the teacher was reading from that book and it made me feel uncomfortable, and it was dealing with race. And so it ignites that ability. While you can't sue the teacher, that does bring up, and I think, Justin, you mentioned this earlier, an avenue or an opportunity for parents or for students to make complaints. How do we prepare our teachers, or how do we prepare our educators to defend against these, especially given that in most cases it's probably going to be hearsay, right? Because nobody's in the classroom with these teachers. How do you know that something was taught? There's not like there's a set curriculum. And so how do you guard against that? And I will start with Grace. Is there any kind of training that's being given to educators to kind of help them steer away from these complaints, or how to guard against the complaints, or in the classroom? Are they doing any training to help monitor what's going on in the classrooms? Is that something that they're going to start doing? Do you have any insight on that?
I wanted to comment on what Justin had mentioned earlier. I retired from Arlington ISD, and my first position was in 1990, and I basically integrated the administrative staff in Arlington. First Black assistant principal at Arlington High, first principal at Carter Junior High, and I worked in the personnel department, and I handled many of the racial concerns and know exactly the one that you're talking about with the elementary school. And what happens is that Arlington found itself trying to raise the level of sensitivity and cultural awareness so that they could create an atmosphere where children can learn comfortably without their race and background being a factor, or feeling like they did not belong or were not accepted in a classroom setting. And that's a ongoing problem right up to today. And that can't be put under the umbrella of critical race theory. It's a behavior. It's a behavior that's founded in ignorance. It's founded in lack of sensitivity, lack of awareness, lack of appreciation for people of color, of other backgrounds. All of that is a part of how we interact with our students and our faculties every day. And I think the state may be trying to come at it from a different angle and define something, but it's really what happens from day to day in our classrooms, incident by incident. And that is going to have to be addressed, and training is required. Arlington has for years, one training session after another, hired different people to come in to try to bridge that abusive gap in some cases, where the classrooms can have a better environment so that kids can feel comfortable in being educated with each other, regardless of age, K through 12. Race should not be a factor in how you're educated. And so I don't know how the House bill is going to take into account, but there is a need for cultural awareness training and creating an environment that's comfortable for all children to learn in, regardless of their background or their color. I don't know if that helps you much, but that's that's what I see is happening in a lot of our districts in the DFW area.
And one of the things that HB 3979 did was it created a training. It said that they would provide training on this new law and legislation to kind of help the educators to know what they can or cannot do. So there will be training. Under that bill, though, the training wasn't going to start until 2022, 2023, even though it took effect in September of last year. And under SB 3, they are also going to provide training. There's a whole section in the bill that talks about the training and helping the teachers, educators get that training so that they know kind of their boundaries. And so that training they have actually in that one in the bill towards the back, it says that they are going to do that. They have to do it by 2025. And so I agree. What I'm seeing, what I've seen in my research is that some school districts have already started doing kind of their own training because they want their educators, one, to feel supported, but they also want to make sure that they provide those boundaries because it will be very difficult to set up any kind of administrative process or due process if the educators are not familiar with what is or what does not cross that boundary. I agree with Justin, though, in that in the curriculum that's already been approved, meaning that most of these curriculums, when they are for the classes that we see, when they're going through, they go through an approval process. So it's not like you can just bring in an outside book into your classroom and start teaching. Teachers that do that, there are already rules in place that would prevent that. And I could definitely see why that would happen because you don't want anyone just bringing in any kind of material, especially that hasn't been approved or reviewed into the classroom. And so the new curriculum, the new civic studies will require some additional revisions to a lot of the course books that are already available. And that is something that the law has recognized. And so there is going to be a lot of shift, probably a lot of funding, a lot of things that will go into that will have to be taken into account as they get ready to prepare their educators and enforce this law. And so I said all that to say this. I want to provide a disclaimer that we're at the very beginning of this law. And so that's why you're hearing the terms vague, broad, still requires development. But I wanted us to be aware of what is happening. I wanted us to be aware of the context of the legislation so that when we're having these conversations, we're doing it from a place of knowledge and wisdom. When we're talking with, if you are in school law and you are providing assistance to educators, you know how best to protect them or how best to help them from a due process standpoint. And Jessica, with respect to follow up on that comment, and then I'm going to address some of the questions that we have in the audience because it's getting close to the end. But Jessica, what would you recommend for anyone that is in school, that's doing school law, or that represents educators, or any educators that may be on the call? How would they best be served to prepare for this rule that's actually already in effect? Do they need to be scared about what they're teaching? Should they be afraid of not mentioning one thing for fear of being sanctioned or fired? How would you recommend or give them advice or counsel? And you're not being held to this because you're not getting paid a retainer fee, nor do we have a contract, so you're free to change if you actually get a client. So
I would say this. I would think for the majority of educators, there's no concern. Again, like we said before, critical race theory or half the things mentioned in this bill is not being taught in the schools anyway. But I would say if you do have a book or if you do have something that you're unsure about, always talk to your district leaders and get clarification. I think this is a great time to look at it, look at what you're teaching, look at the type of discussions that you have, and get clarification from your administrators to determine, is this appropriate in the classroom? And when in doubt, maybe not explore it, at least not right now. I think you're on mute, Nikki.
I am. I was trying to silence myself. Justin, could you give us your opinion on what you think is going to be the best way? I think that when we had this conversation a couple of days ago, you provided some great, like you said, I think this gives our administrators the opportunity, the school administrators and the boards, to really provide that support to the educators and really set the tone for how this rule will work within that school district. So can you share how you envision this legislation getting rolled out in its fullness and how it will impact the educators?
Well, I can, so many things can happen. I can tell you what I hope happens.
Okay.
As both a former teacher, a parent, I have family members who teach in Arlington ISD and just really invested here. in the educational community. And as a TASB board member, my hope is that this bill, to the extent anyone ever hoped or intended that it would chill conversations about accurate factual history, warts and all, I hope that doesn't come to pass. And I think the message for administrators and trustees is, that if that was an intent of the bill and it starts to become used that way, then it behooves them to stand up for and support their employees. And I know that sounds a little Pollyannish, and I know Jessica's over there because she represents, I'm sure, teachers in disputes with school districts. She's like, I've never seen that happen. But I have had the, unfortunately have in my time on the board sat on a few employee grievance panels. But given the, the board is there and acts in a quasi judicial capacity, as at least in Arlington ISD, we're the last stop on the grievance train. And unfortunately, most employees, in my experience, don't follow the grievance process at all, or they only stick with it for the first few levels. And so the board, which is supposed to act independently and reach the right decision, they rarely get involved. And in my time on the board, we've only had 3 employment grievances reach our level 4, which is the board, out of what I'm sure are many grievances that never got anywhere close. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons that people make the calculus of not bringing it to our level, but you can't, you can't fix something that never gets in your court, so to speak, right? And I can say that I have voted against 2 of the 3 employee terminations I voted against. So I think that it starts with campus level and district level administrators being reasonable about this and knowing when something is politically motivated, when a teacher was trying to educate their students. And if they can, it really is going to fall, I think, the brunt on them to make sure that this doesn't have the effect of chilling reasonable, accurate teaching of material that, quite frankly, until this came up, was probably being taught with no real issues, because so much of it is, going to objectively, so much of it is objectively defendable. I mean, you can't talk about, disparities in income inequality and things like that without talking about a history of housing inequality, and housing inequality in many parts of the country has its roots in racial discrimination. And that's, that was a fact of life that was embodied in laws. Same thing with educational inequality and segregation. So, I think, when I was teaching social studies here, and when I was in law school, we talked about those issues because that's already part of their curriculum to some extent. Is, you're not going to talk about Brown versus Board of Education without talking about what the consequences of segregated schooling was. And so I think, administrators were once educators, and if they can remember that, I think we'll tamp down the chilling effect of this bill and make it, again, much ado about nothing.
I agree, and I hope that is the outcome too, Justin. And I do think that, like I said, HB 39, well, now SB 3, because I keep saying that HB 3979 is gone, SB 3. I do hope that it is much ado about nothing, and that it doesn't put a chilling effect on educators that are out there really teaching history, not one side, because it can get on both political sides. Even those proponents of critical race theory, they disagree on exactly the concepts of critical race theory. So it is a very interesting and complex topic that I think is best left out of our kindergarten through 12th grades. They don't understand that, and they have enough to deal with. And I just think it's a burden to put them in the middle of some of the struggles that are going on here. We have about 6 minutes left, and so I want to make sure I'm addressing questions from the audience. I see that we have a very active chat. Rudy, thank you for answering some of those questions, and I like how some of the individuals in the chats have been answering each other, so you guys don't even need us to answer those questions. So I thank you. It's a very lively chat going on here. One of the questions that we got, and this says, do the bills mean teachers cannot teach concepts of white privilege and systemic racism in the history of housing? For example, is there any so-called legislative history that gives us a reason to be hopeful about the scope of this broad legislation? So those are two different questions. I would say for the first question, it says, do the bills mean teachers cannot teach concepts of white privilege? I would say based on the plain language of the statute, it could probably be problematic. And so I'm going to say no, because of the concept of white privilege and how you would teach that in a way where it would be objective. I don't know necessarily that if there's even any curriculum in the schools that are focusing on white privilege per se. So I guess it would really depend on what the subject matter is and the nature in which the conversation is being had. Keeping in mind that the legislation simply says that if you bring up a current issue or a topic, it has to be done in a way that is that shows a differing perspective and doesn't focus on one or the other. White privilege in and of itself, if that's the only conversation you're talking about, if you were to apply the law to that, it could seem that you are saying that whites or that other races are inferior to whites, and that due to the white privilege, and it could create some issues with one race being kind of considered over the other, or a perspective that seems to elevate one race over the other, or it could have the impact of making a student feel uncomfortable, which is a part of that legislation. So I'm gonna err on the safe side and say for that, I would say, yeah, I wouldn't be teaching that per se in that manner. And then and I'll defer to Jessica since she's does litigation, and Justin, would you agree with that?
I mean, I agree,
Okay.
but I also don't think, just looking at the TEKS, educators teach the TEKS. You don't have any TEKS that talks about white privilege anyway. So I feel like a lot of the concepts that we will probably associate with critical race theory, like Grace has said before and how Justin said before, they're not coming into the classroom. But that doesn't stop, like how Justin's just saying, some of the other topics that are very important that have been taught, that are associated with the TEKS, they're still going to be taught.
So yeah, because it goes on to talk about systemic racism and the history of housing. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and it's been a while since I've been to school, y'all, so do not blame me, but I thought that there was a lesson that was taught back in the day in history class that talked about the housing market and segregation and some of the issues with race and things. And I believe that's something that would still be able to be taught. You would just have to, it's a part of the curriculum that's already approved. And so my argument, because the law is so broad, would be, hey, I'm teaching the curriculum that you approved, right? So if it's a history lesson and it's something that's already in the books, until they remove that or until they change that curriculum, I don't see why that would be a problem per se. Because as Justin has pointed out, Jessica's pointed out, and Grace, there are a lot of these topics that are already a part of the regular historical curriculum, and that's not going to change, right? It says, is there any so-called legislative history that gives us reason to be hopeful about the scope of this broad legislation? Well, that's a very interesting question. And I'm gonna err on the side of this legislation. If you really look at the meat and bones of Senate Bill 3, until they really define and they really establish the enforcement policies and the rules and provide training, it's gonna be hard for a teacher. This is good for an educator, for that educator to know when it's been violated, or even to be held to have violated. It's going to be more of an administrative concern, because what's going to happen is you're going to have to go through that complaint process, and nobody likes to do that. I know we as attorneys don't like to go through complaint processes, even though we know that we haven't done anything and people file grievances against us, and you have to defend against that. I would assume that'd be no different here. But in the end, hopefully these teachers come out triumphant, because they are using wisdom, and they're not doing anything that blatantly would create a problem. But with the broad scope of the way that the bill is written, there's a lot of room for interpretation. And so I think that because it's so broad, if they don't make it more restrictive or amend it even further in the next legislative session, right now, I think it leaves a lot to be discovered. And to be honest, it could just be a political pony. So, and that's my answer to that. So we're at 7:00 on the dot. Do we have, I will allow one more question, because I know that we talked for a while. Are there any more questions, or is everybody, I think, like I said in the chat, a lot of the questions were getting answered, or they were just discussions. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap up, and I'm just going to say, one, I appreciate everybody for attending. I hope that this was informative, and that it gives you a little bit more insight into what all is happening in Texas with respect to our educators. I want to thank our educators for the time that they are spending with our students and those that are defending educators, those that are working on school boards to help get this curriculum, and all of those that volunteer in the community. Thank you so much. The CLE course number, we will send that out in the email. I do not have that. Paul, do you by chance have that number? Okay, so we applied for the credit, and we have to be patient with them. It's still pending. I will make sure, if I have your email and that you register, that you get this information so that you can ensure that you get your credit for this course. And so my email address is in the chat. I'm going to give you guys a couple of seconds to write this down. And I'm going to put that there. And if you guys have any issues, let me know, and you can send me an email, and I will make sure that you have the MCLE number so you can get that approved. Okay. And Happy New Year for everybody. I don't know how long we're allowed to say that. I think if it's my first time seeing you, I can say it. I haven't seen any of you in the chat this year, so that's why I'm telling you Happy New Year now. And I hope and I pray that your new year is going great. Rudy, thank you. Do you have any closing words, or our president, our current chair, Paul Stafford, who is on, do either one of you have any additional information before we conclude that you would like to share or say?
I defer to Paul first.
Okay. Paul?
I chatted only thanks. Thanks for putting this together, and thanks to all the panelists for a great and informative CLE.
And I want to concur. Again, there's a lot going on in our country right now. And the only way we're going to go ahead and get through this is by working together and trying to find viable, concrete information that we can apply and we can all look at to work on these specific issues. We have no problems with people's opinions or ideas or viewpoints, but when they start to go ahead and from conjecture and start to, I think Jessica put it, try to color what facts and information and data points, particularly when it comes to our children, that's when, you know, in all sincerity, we have to have a real discussion of what's going on within our schools right here as well. I'm hopeful that what Justin had to say is true, that in the end, this bill will just be a nothing burger, for a better lack of term, and hopefully it won't affect any sort of ability to actually effectuate what the real issues and things that need to be taught to our kids. But even now, in the middle of a pandemic, even now when we're having COVID even weigh on our faculty and staff at these schools, now more than ever, they need each and every one of you to reach out and support them in what they're doing and their actions from there as well. So please not only take the information you hear from today and take that and share it with your groups right there as well. But when you get a chance, say thank you. You know, great to their best. You know, they are the true workers. There's workers in our society right now trying to go ahead and bring a semblance of normalcy during, honestly, an unnormal time. So thank you for being here tonight. And Nikki, phenomenal job as always. But we're blessed to have you as president or chair-elect, of our board, and just putting this distinguished August panel together. Even better, I'm from DFW. I went to school at Nolan Catholic, so it's great that you got Fort Worth folks involved right here.
Arlington.
We still love you, Jessica. You're from Houston, but DFW. There we go from there.
Arlington, you know what? I'm going to say this, and then Arlington always gets overlooked. They moved the Dallas Cowboys Stadium to Arlington. They still say Dallas Cowboys, even though it's Arlington Cowboys. So we'll let you slide with that, Rudy. I just want to, again, thank everybody. One thing before we hang up is what Rudy said is very important. I want you guys to make sure that you are paying attention to any kind of legislative movement with respect to this curriculum. You can get involved if you have questions or concerns. Whenever if your school board is having meetings to discuss this as they start to implement training and different things, get involved, see what you can do, what you can't do, and be involved and be a voice for some of these educators and some of the leaders that we have, so that way they know that we are concerned and that we're not just putting them out there. They already have a lot that they have to deal with. And so if you could take that time out to support them, that would be great. And I'm going to let everybody enjoy the rest of their night. You guys have a great evening. Thank you for your patience with myself and the panel as we work through any kind of technical difficulties. And for my panel, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.